Valley where the sunshine always shines. My name is Joanne McLean and I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Health Sciences, and it's my pleasure today to introduce and welcome to UFE our guest speaker, Sam Waddington. He's the first speaker in our Faculty of Health Sciences speaker series, and so it's a great pleasure to have Sam here on campus. So, by way of a brief introduction, because we want to give Sam all opportunity to have a chance to chat with you and then field your questions and so on, let me provide some few words of introduction. Sam is really the perfect example of the good things to accrue from the following: boundless energy, passion, hard work, vision, experiential learning, and real pride in place. So as you can see, he's a young man. He is in fact a very accomplished young man. A true example, I think, to our students who are here today, that achievement is not necessarily a function of age, right? It's a function of hard work and passion, et cetera, et cetera. Sam grew up here in Chilliwack. He's had a lifelong, I'd say, unquenchable desire for achievement and adventure, and for spending time in the mountains, for hiking and rock climbing and kayaking and all those kinds of outdoor activities. He's traveled extensively with his family as a young person and as a young man, and been in more than 30 countries doing various outdoor pursuits. But really, he's proudest to call Chilliwack, BC his home. In his hometown. He's an entrepreneur. He's the successful owner of Mount Waddington's outdoor pursuits, so the business that's down the street and around the corner from us. He's a civic activist and elected to the City of Chilliwack Council in the fall of 2014. Sam's also broadly engaged in the Chilliwack community. He's a member of committees broad range from the arts and culture, through to the hospital, to Aboriginal relations, to the library, to rural engagement, and I'm not listing all the committee engagement that he's been involved in. Perhaps all though, or most of all, Sam, as I've said before, is a lover of the outdoors and of wilderness experience, and he's a crusader for the potential of the city of Chilliwack and the Chilliwack area to be the destination for outdoor recreation and tourism. He's traveled outdoors to destinations around the world. He knows, however, that the mountains here, the forest, the water that surrounds us where we are, in the area in which he grew up, is some of the most pristine in the world, and efforts to make it accessible to outdoor enthusiasts and known as a tourist destination just makes sense. And so Sam's here today to share with us some of his experiences. His name is his presentation, Back to the Backcountry, Exploring the Wild and Learning from Important Places. Ladies and gentlemen, Sam Waddington.
Thank you. Hello. Thank you all for coming out today, and thanks to the University of the Fraser Valley for hosting events like this. It's an awesome chance to get together and share kind of community and obviously thoughts and ideas, and so I welcome the opportunity to come and speak with you guys today. Welcome the sunshine. I think I'd be a little bit contradictory if I didn't, but it's affecting the images that we're going to see here. So you probably saw me scrambling some last-minute notes, and some of the things that I was hoping the images would say, I'm going to have to say instead. So you get to listen to me a little longer because of that. So I'm going to talk to you today about exploring the wild and learning from the important places. And it basically is this is a mountain scene. It was a mountain scene. But it explores the questions of does the forest make us happier, and can spending time in the backcountry truly affect our well-being and our mental health? And to explore these ideas, I think we need to look at the concept of wild places and do they have an ability to affect us as people and ultimately as humans, I think. So this is going to be a challenge here. Okay. That's a photo of a beautiful lake, and it's supposed to invoke awe and wonder in the backcountry, but instead, maybe just look out the window. So it comes down to my life walk, and I think how I got to where I am today, and so I want to talk to you a little bit about some of the adventures that I've had and the trips that I've been on, some of the traveling that shaped where I am today, and I think ultimately the philosophy that guides me in business, in politics, and then obviously in my personal life, and it comes down to a philosophy too of calibrating myself where I think it's best done, and that's in the backcountry, and sometimes that takes place through risk, and I think that's an important piece of the puzzle that we often try to avoid rather than embrace. So to start about why am I fixated on the backcountry, obviously that's my life walk, and I probably am not reflective enough quite to judge myself and say if that's been a good life walk so far or not. But it's what I know and love, and I think ultimately it's contradictory to a lot of what we see as being the goal of society, and especially kind of through modern history, and I would say during the central part of the 20th century. I think this is the ideal. You know, that's the 1950s commercialized ideal of what we were supposed to achieve and what we were supposed to pursue. And for me, this has never really held a resonance, but I think for a lot of people it has, and it's ultimately shifted the culture that we live in today. And I think a lot of the problems that we're dealing with, and certainly those in the health sciences department would be the most familiar with a lot of the social ills that have come from our modern constructs of how we've organized society. I think the American dream, and to a large part the Canadian dream, looks something like this. And other than some manicured hedges, I don't think it really incorporated a wilderness component into the design as part of what they viewed was integrally important. And I think a lot of that comes down to the picturesque ideal here. Those some nice khakis. They're going to have a barbecue. It's going to be great. And so it looks like a good time. But that needs to be offset with, with where we go and play and challenge ourselves. And I think it's been a desire to decrease all of those unmanicured spaces, all those uncontrollables in life. And we do that through design, and we do it, I think, intentionally in its micro aspects. But when we look at the greater effect of what that has, when we start to cultivate an entire city, or when we start to cultivate our entire lives and reduce risk and reduce exposure and all those elements, we cut ourselves out of the backcountry intrinsically, because they're naturally dirty spots and they're naturally filled with risk and unknown, which is probably what draws me to those places, but it's also what's pushed our society away from those places. So in the last couple of decades, we've seen a lot of this. We've seen a lot of risk-adverse people, and we've seen a societal mentality that shifts that way. And the byproduct of that social construct is well known, but that's anxiety and depression. We have issues with obesity and diabetes that I think are all inextricably linked, and not sole sourced, but inextricably linked to the hyper-sterilization of our societies, but also our disconnect from the natural world. So recent studies on mental health, and I'm sure that I'm preaching to the choir here, but that have shown that youth are 5 to 10 times more likely to suffer from severe depression than they were 30 years ago. And I don't think human biology has shifted quite that quickly. So it's something that we're doing to ourselves. And in an era that we would probably deem as one of the most enlightened in world history, and certainly one of the most affluent in world history, this seems at odds with what we're trying to achieve overall. So there's a study in the US from the Center of Disease Control that looked at high school students, and they looked at what are the things that are leading to some of the statistics they're finding around attempted suicide, contemplated suicide, and planned suicides. And they found that 16% of youth in the United States, of a sample set of 50,000 students that they interviewed across the nation, 16% of youth had contemplated, planned, or actually attempted suicide within the 12 months prior to that study taking place. And so we're not doing something right. And I'm sure that many of you know this, but the culprits to that have been linked back to things such as screen time skyrocketing to 5 to 8 hours per day in the average kid in America and Canada. And helicopter parents are not helping either. This is supposed to be a photo from inside my medicine cabinet of my antidepressants. Not actually. That photo should be cute if it wasn't so sad and indicative, I think, of a lot of the photos that people probably have in their albums of their own kids. And I think ultimately it's also coming back to the way we're raising our kids and the things that we're deeming are important. So helicopter parenting is the best intentioned thing that we've come up with. It's rooted from the best place, which is to try to eliminate all the ills from our kids' lives, to try to speak to our children in a way that they're going to understand. But ultimately, what it does is it reduces their ability to make decisions for themselves, to take risks for themselves, and it's delaying adolescence well into what used to be adulthood. I like to think of my great-grandma coming over from Russia, and she was left behind with her littlest brother, and the family all went on ahead because he had pneumonia. She was 7 in England, didn't speak the language, and that was her job to take care of her sick little brother. We aren't building kids to be able to do that today. We need to allow them to take risks. We need to allow them to feel exposure, and I think there's a maturation and I think there's a maturity that comes to someone when they've experienced those kinds of things, and the best place that I've found that is in the backcountry. I mean, you could dodge traffic too, but not quite as organic feeling. So a lot of the screen time that we're seeing, and we all see it as people sit in coffee shops or as they wander down the road, they're glued to their screen. It's a strive to not feel bored. It's our coping mechanism, and I had the privilege of listening to Roberta Bondar, a Canadian astronaut, first female Canadian in space, and she loves to say that there is a known cure for boredom, and it's called curiosity, and that curiosity should manifest itself in the outdoors, and it should manifest itself in self-directed learning. She doesn't say that you should kind of scroll through your Instagram feed or start an organic farm on Sims to feel connected to nature for a reason, and I think that's because those aren't models that are proven to work. So when it comes to educating kids, and I know I'm taking full circle way of getting back to what I want to talk about, which is the backcountry, but we teach our kids a lot of things. We teach them about mental health, least most of all of the things I think that we ingrain in our children. We talk to them about physical health, about financial health and social health, and how to interact with others and plan for your future. We have kids who know about preventative maintenance, not just putting a Band-Aid on a wound, not just healing a physical wound, but actually preventative maintenance of brushing your teeth twice a day. They're not going to notice for months and months if they don't do that, the ills of that health. However, we're teaching preventative maintenance, and I don't think that we're doing that in the mental health component. And so I choose to talk about the backcountry as a solution to that. I choose to talk about connecting to nature as the best method of getting there. And I know that I haven't provided any solutions so far, but I think that the answer's in front of us, and it's a lack of a pardon me, I'm sick. Maybe my healthy living hasn't exactly paid off, but it's a lack of a connection to nature, and I think, again, if we look at why we're having these issues as a society, I think to me that's a fascinating part of it, because I look at it and I just think, how come not everybody is like John here and has a kayak on the roof of his truck? How come not everybody understands that that's an important piece to what we do? And I think it's because we've never had to deal with this before. I mean, the Industrial Revolution's not that long ago. I think a disconnection from natural place is a foreign concept for humans. We're not good at dealing with it. Societally, we're not conditioned to dealing with it. And we're slower to adapt the ways in which we cope than we are to adapt to new technologies and realize the ill effects that they may have. And obviously the the vehicles and the mechanization of our world has not helped with that either, because we don't need to get our hands dirty and pull our own crops anymore, which I think is an essential piece to feeling connected to your place as well. And so all of this comes down to me assuming that there is a connection between humans and place, and it's called the biophilia hypothesis. And that's that humans have an intrinsic connection to nature, and they have an intrinsic liking of nature, and that it's an important piece. And so when we look at a lot of the things that I think are indicative of this, if you hear a loud noise, if there were a bang in that back hallway, we would all maybe jump or cringe. It invokes a fight or flight mechanism. But on the flip side of that spectrum, if we were all to just sit in absolute, complete, still silence, that's used in solitary confinement as a torture mechanism. We're not used to that either. We don't do well in those conditions. And so we like ambient noise. We like natural noises. And I had an interesting opportunity. I went over to a friend's house who recently had a child and wandered into the bedroom of, she was napping, and there was one of those sound making machines on. And it was the sound of a babbling brook, something maybe like this. But then I realized she's never been to a babbling brook. She's never been anywhere near a place like that. The other settings were rustling fall leaves or those gentle breeze components, and she had never heard those sounds either. And so why is it that we do those things? Those aren't connected to her personal experiences, so why would they be comforting? Wouldn't we put on the dial tone of a fax machine or the rush hour traffic lull noises in the background with honking horns? You would think that if it's connected to experience and if it's connected to your own cognitive places, that would connect you to the things that you know and feel comfortable with. But I think that we do have these proofs of that biophilia component. So I think this is the culprit. I think for me, this is what's always pushing the bad decisions that I make, or at least pushing me to feel stressed and anxious, and it's our perception of time. It's that ruthless ticking, right? It's always ticking, and it's always subtracting, and we know that. We like to think that time counts up. It kind of makes us feel good watching time count up, but it's always counting down in our lives. It's always counting towards some undefined end. We don't know when it will be, and we want to cram in as much before that as possible so that we can feel like we lived a full and useful life, I think. And yet, we try to cheat time, and you can't. You can only fit so much into a 12-hour day, and if you didn't do it that day, there's only 12 hours the next waking day, or 24 if you want to be super productive, I suppose. But to do that. And so when I turned 26, I'd just been elected to council, and my parents bought me a new watch. I guess it's part of like the kit, to fit in and look proper. So I couldn't dress myself, so they bought me a watch. And they engraved something on the back of it, and to me it was really important, and it was really fitting given the fact that it was a timepiece. And the inscription said, "The past is a memory, and the future is but a promise, and so it is always now." And I think for me that's helped guide the things that I find important. And I think we all know that now is all that we have. And I'm not talking about like hashtagging YOLO to your bar selfies with your friends. Hopefully there's not too young of an audience here, but one. She can't read. Perfect. It's all good. But I love this. I think I'm going to get a t-shirt made. But it's making sure that we prioritize every single day. And it's making sure that we are mindful of yesterday, we learn from yesterday, and that we do plan and we save for tomorrow. But heaven forbid, if tomorrow never comes, let's hope that we didn't live every one of our todays for some tomorrow that we're never going to realize, because we do need to make sure that we're living in the moment. And that's a fine balance to strike, but I think it's important. And this, for me, was most relevant when I was guiding in Alaska. That's supposed to be 3 airplanes on a beach. And we were sitting around the campfire with some clients, and we were talking about life and choices and success and happiness, and sort of those philosophical thoughts that come from a long day of hiking and whiskey. And there was this one guy from Texas. He was in his 60s, and he was exorbitantly wealthy. He had come to Alaska for a 2-week guided trip, and it was $50,000. And he comes every year. And these are the kinds of moments that that definitely put in perspective the difference in the way that people live their lives. But he looked across the fire at my friend Dan and I, who were guiding there, and we were there guiding because we were making money. We had to work to be in the backcountry because there was no other way we could afford the 25 grand it cost to get out there into the bush like he did. And he said to us, "I wish I knew what you guys know now when I was your age." And whether he was accurate in his assessment of us just from a few days of getting to know us, I think what he was talking about is truthful. And it saddened me. He was a man full of regret, and he kind of felt cheated by life. He had strove so hard, and he had succeeded above all odds, and he had fulfilled that end goal of being wealthy and having the ability to travel exorbitantly and do the things that he wanted to do. And he wasn't in a place of mental or physical health to be able to enjoy that. And I'm not saying you can't enjoy travel and doing things when you're his age, which is, in his early 60s, but it's very different than the kind of enjoyment you're going to get from a trip when you're in your 20s. And you can never get that back. You can't save in your 20s and go on a trip in your 40s and do it like you're 20. It doesn't work that way. And I told myself when I watched him that, and when he was talking to us, I promised myself that I'd never repeat those mistakes. It was a really profound moment for me of making sure I wouldn't take life for granted, and that I balanced appropriately the balance between the future and the present. And I understand most university students are sacrificing a certain part of their present for a piece of the future, and that's important too. But it's all in balance, and you need to make sure that you're continually calibrating even in those moments. I think Jack London puts it very well, the author. He says, the proper function... Oh, that's too bad. Those are volcanoes in the background. This is like a beautiful camp, and the Aleutian Islands in the background, but you can't see that. And this is my friend Dan and I canoeing down a river, being frozen cold in the Alaskan north. I think this was the experience that that man was imagining when he was talking about a life that he wished he had lived. But Jack London said the proper function of a person is to live, not to merely exist. I shall not waste my days trying to prolong them. And I love that. I think we all spend a lot of time organizing our days so that we don't waste our days, and we organize ourselves to the end of having no extra time in our day. And it comes down to the choice between embracing that mentality and not, ultimately. There's not a lot of gray zone in between. And so after high school, this is kind of the fodder for my education early on. And so after high school, I took off and I traveled. And this is my early days. This is before I had conscious traveling planning skill. But my parents took us on a sailing trip for 3.5 years. We sailed through the South Pacific Islands and down through Mexico from the west coast here, and spent a bunch of time basically living the life of Riley as a kid. It was as good as I can imagine. It was an example in kind of experiential learning. We didn't do much formal education. My mom's a school teacher, but we didn't really need to. We were reading well above our grade levels because we had long passages to get time to pass, and we were journaling. We were studying other cultures and dissecting fish and seeing what they were eating, and basically the only thing we were doing was math, and that's converting currency to Mexican pesos or to the French francs that they were using in the South Pacific Islands. So yeah, it was an interesting experience and a case example of that for us. But this is the philosophy that my parents raised us with, and that's there are only two lasting promises that we can hope to give our children. One is roots, and the other is wings. And for me, that's That's key. I call Chilliwack home. This is my home. We moved here when I was 2 years old, and I'm proud to say that this is my home. But I've spent many years since high school and throughout school not being here, and yet always having that place that I could call home. And that's not rooted in a house. That's not rooted in a family dynamic. That's rooted in a connection, a personal connection that I had, fostered through my parents, but to this place. To the way the seasons change and the river levels going up and down, and watching that snow line dance up and down the face of Siam. That to me is integral to my definition of place, and I always call this home whether my parents are ever here or not. So my goal was to craft a unique experience, to see the world, and again I had a great example to follow. That's my parents' 1971 VW van that's still on the road, and that's what I grew up road tripping in. That's what I grew up experiencing. So I traveled backpacked through Europe and Asia, worked as a scuba diving guide in Egypt, as a hunting and kind of backcountry guide in Alaska. I did some photo work in, this is truly a speaker series, not a slideshow presentation. Did some photo work in West Africa for some aid organizations when I was there as well. All of this at a very amateur level. I dabble in many things, and I have mastered very, very few of them. And but always in between, I had to make money, and I'd come home and I'd go tree planting. And for those of you who have ever been tree planting, you would know that it raises probably more questions than answers, and that comes from spending 10 or 12 hours alone in the bush by yourself, toiling and dealing with bugs and black flies in northern BC and Alberta. But I think through that hardship and diversity, you come to a lot of conclusions. And so this was on repeat in my mind, I think, as I was going through those periods of my life, which was, I'm having a lot of fun traveling, but I'm now entering my early 20s. What am I doing? I hadn't gone to university. I had done a semester here and there, but I wasn't really focused on a goal and achieving it. I was doing what felt right at the time and jumping from adventure to adventure. I didn't feel guilty about that, but I kind of felt like I was ready for another phase. And so Ayn Rand's quote, "The two great attributes of life, motion and purpose," rang true for me. I had the motion part figured out, but the purpose was lacking still. And I think it comes down to, for me, it comes down to an understanding of what's important to you, and that takes some time because it's always different than what's important to the people around you. And so this is a Martha Washington quote that I love, and I'm throwing a lot of quotes at you. I learn from those around me as much as possible, and I feel like their words are wiser than mine, but she said, "I have learned from my experiences that the greater part of happiness or misery depends on our disposition and not on our circumstances." And tree planting is a case example of that for me, but it kind of came to show me that I need to be finding happiness no matter where I am, and I need to not be so idealistic about thinking that I can only be happy on a beach in the sun or hiking in the mountains, that you can find happiness if you choose to, wherever it is that you are. And this is a photo of us getting picked up tree planting in a helicopter. One of the moments when the wind from the rotor blades washes the bugs away. It's a beautiful time of day. I don't know who said this quote, but experience is a hard teacher because she gives the test first and the lessons afterwards. And I love that. And so it's experience and it's learning through failure. And I kind of came to realize that if failure is the seed that we need to sow so that we learn on the back end, and that's the harvest, then I was going to choose to fail extravagantly and grandly, because maybe then the harvest would be bigger on the back end. I don't know if that technique works, but it was what I was pushing towards. So when I came back from planting every season, there were certain things that definitely rang true for me, and it was a slow culmination of understanding that there were distinct differences between urban and backcountry, and it wasn't just about that was freedom and this is work or this is life, because I traveled urban as well, and it was just never the same. And I think it was about a clarity that comes from adventure and comes from the backcountry ultimately, comes from nature, versus the noise of the of the urban environment. And this was the first that I heard of NDD, Nature Deficit Disorder. And I don't know how many of you have heard that term, but it was coined by an author, Richard Louv, in 2005 in his book, Last Child in the Woods. Maybe that's the last child, I don't know. Outdoor living room, I like it. But he talked about the disconcerting trends about mental wellness in youth, and about same things that we talked about before, screen time, helicopter parenting, and access to the backcountry were what the things he defined as the limiters to those health and wellness components in youth. And so there's those catchphrases that started to emerge, and these trends started to grow. The catchphrases like place-based learning or the pedagogy of place, and ultimately over the last couple of decades we've seen a surge in alternate learning practices in forest kindergarten, which is what those kids are up to out there. I think that's on Salt Spring Island. But Richard's second book in 2011 addressed the broader problem, which is that NDD, or nature deficit disorder, is not just showing signs in youth. Obviously, it's seeding its way throughout society. I think adults are just better at coping with it, or perhaps not coping with it, but masking it in some cases. And so it raised, for me, the big question of what would our lives look like, and what would the lives of kids look like if we spent as much time in the backcountry as we do glued to our screens and glued to our technology, and what would that approach look like societally? And it's easy to focus on the problems. We look at screen time, or we look at a long commute, or those sorts of things, and those are the problems. And so minimizing that helps, for sure. But I think there's also the countering attributes, which is you can still have a long commute, and you can still have a stressful job. But so long as you go recharge in the backcountry, you can offset some of that component. Other than some terrifying statistics, which is that if you have a commute more than 2 hours a day, you're 40% more likely to get divorced in your life. So keep that in mind when you get a job in Vancouver. But ultimately, you know, this begs the question, so do we all just like pack it up and leave right here and leave your books on the table and we take off to the hills? And I think the master of this was this guy, Christopher McLandris. Granted, he did die in a school bus in Alaska alone, and about 100 pounds, so maybe he took it a little bit too far, but I think, you know, he had some good ideas along the way. And I love one of his quotes, and it should be stated that being footloose has always exhilarated us. It's associated in our minds with escape from history and oppression, and law and irksome obligations. Absolute freedom and the road have always led west. Well, we're already west. So I'm going to take some creative license and say then if the road's already west, then maybe it continues up into the mountains. And I think that's kind of what he was getting at, that wild place, that horizon that we're not currently in. And so maybe we're not going to renounce all of our possessions, but I do believe firmly in sometime in your life, preferably early on in your life, go on a grand adventure. I've seen it anecdotally throughout my life that those people, whether they're currently traveling or not, they travel, and it's not an escape, and it shouldn't be viewed as an escape. And a lot of times we take a look at vacations as an escape from here. I need to get away. I need to go find some sun this winter and go to an all-inclusive and just sit on a beach. But there's this quote, I travel not to escape life, but so that life does not escape me. And I think that there's something that comes from having a unique adventure of your own. And I think we can all attribute time as a fluxing sort of construct, because how long was that trip that you took? If anyone's gone traveling and you took 2-3 weeks off and you went backpacking somewhere, that occupies a massive piece of your mental fabric. It's a huge space of time. And yet the 2 weeks following last New Year's when you were at work, you probably don't recall those quite so distinctly. And so I think that it comes down to, for me, a triggered memory. It comes down to the fact that when I look at this photo, it takes me to a warm and a cozy place, and it gives me a feeling of peace, because to me this is a month in Alaska. This is a month that I lived on my own and did my own thing, and that's a calming thing. And we're really familiar with the flip side of that. You've probably heard people say, oh, just thinking about that stresses me out. You know, we draw those connections, and I think that we can do that to ourselves, but it also works the other way. So Sir Edmund Hillary talks about a connection to nature, and he talks about heading back to the hills. And he says, despite all I have seen and experienced, I get the same simple thrill out of glimpsing a tiny patch of snow high in a mountain gully and feel that same urge to climb towards it. And it's not about ticking things off of your bucket list. It never was for him. But it's about a profound longing to be in the mountains and knowing what that does for you. And I think that that's what he was speaking to, and he speaks about it in his other writing as well. So there's a guy named John Muir. Lots of you are probably familiar with him. This is one of his early sketches of the Yosemite Valley. But he was an environmental philosopher, an activist, and ended up being a writer and an artist as well. But he probably took one of the most fundamental, groundbreaking camping trips in American history, and it was super successful. In 1903, him and President Roosevelt at the time went in there, and he convinced President Roosevelt, just in the experience of 3 days in a tent, how important these wild places were, how important they were to preserve as the country grew and as the country expanded west. And so that trip directly led over the subsequent years in Roosevelt's tenure there to the formation of Yosemite National Park, Glacier Bay National Park in Alaska, Mount Rainier National Park in Washington, and the preservation in large part at the beginning to the Californian Great Redwoods in Northern California. And so he's been a source of inspiration for many outdoor adventures throughout the centuries. And in 1901, I think he was talking about something that I find very interesting, because I try to think about what 1901 looked like. I try to think about why we would need to connect with nature in a time when I think most people were very integrally connected to the places in which they lived, just out of the rural nature that most people had. But in 1901, he wrote, "Climb the mountains and get their good tidings. Nature's peace will flow into you as sunshine flows into trees. The winds will blow their freshness into you, and the storms their energy. Cares will drop off of you like autumn leaves." And he talked about seeking refuge in the wild, and I think that if that was relevant in 1901, it's certainly far more relevant today, as the noise of our lives and certainly the urban nature of our lives is far more pronounced than it was then. So for me, risk is important. When I enter the backcountry, I need to feel a sense of exposure, partially, and whether that's an exposed ski line or it's a traveling trip that takes me to an unknown place, or it's that's a view over Elk Mountain from my paraglider yesterday, and it provides a clarity of thought. For me, risk is a form of it's a form of meditation. When you're exposed and when you're at risk, and I think many of us feel it in unopportune times and in times that we're not personally choosing, so we don't cope with it well. But when you openly welcome that into your life, and when you choose to engage with that risk adds a clarity of thought, because you have to be in that moment. You have to be there, focused exclusively on that one thing. And it's a form of meditation that I think only can come from engaging in risk in the backcountry, or engaging in exposure. And it might just be a drop-off on that trail next to you, but it requires your attention to make sure that you are dealing with that risk appropriately. And so I think that a large part of society has been a little bit duped into believing that the calm, cozy, risk-free environment is what we should strive for. I choose instead to say that we need some risk, and that we need to be embracing curiosity at all costs, because that's the fountain of what I think is at the core of youthful vitality, and that youthfulness that continues to spur our learning and our curiosity. So there are places in the world that do this well, and one of the ones that I love to focus on is the Himalayan mountain kingdom of Bhutan, and they're often overlooked for just about everything other than if you're a mountaineer or a trekker. But they have this beautiful thing called GNH, and it's gross national happiness, and it's how they calibrate progress in their country instead of gross national product like most Western countries do. And although it might seem kind of quaint and naive, and it probably works great when your only export is tourism, But I think it's a fundamental shift that's really important to look at, and they've done it really well, and they're a beautiful case example of people that are focused on other things. People are focused on a priority around happiness, and that's rooted in their connection to place and in the humility that comes from being in the mountains. And so for me, as I pile on more and more layers of complication to my life and stresses, it's integrally more important for me to head off into the backcountry, to recalibrate, to reconnect. And in those moments, I think for all of us, when we feel the most stressed out, when we feel like we don't have time to do anything and we need to be hitting the books, we need to be doing those things, those are precisely the times that you need to get out and recharge your batteries, because nothing does it better than the backcountry. And I've found this in my life, in business or in politics or in my personal life. It takes a consistent effort to get back into the backcountry, and it's just to walk along the river. It's go off to a quiet place. It's a hike in the mountains. It doesn't have to be a long time, but it's a really important piece to mental well-being. And I'll finish it off with a quote from John Muir: "The mountains are calling, and I must go." And for me, it's as simple as that. Thank you. So I know many of you probably have to head off to class or wherever you're off to next, but I've got some time if you have any questions for me and you are sticking around. Yeah, Chris?
Maybe I should use that. I'll ask. So, first of all, thanks. That was a really great talk and great message and great words. I think I would have enjoyed the picture a lot too. It looked good from what I could see. I'm just wondering, I like the idea that you're talking about connecting with nature and going off and seeking adventure. But I was wondering if I could sort of switch you into your entrepreneurial mode and talk a little bit about Chilliwack and maybe some of the opportunities you see here to bring people here to find their adventure.
Yeah. Thanks, and yeah, I'm infinitely passionate about Chilliwack, and it's a huge part, not just because I'm from here, but of why I stay here. We have some of the best backcountry in the world, and I truly believe that. And the diversity is here as well. So you don't just have to be a trail runner or a climber or mountaineer, but mountain biking or kayaking or whatever outdoor pursuit you want to find, it's here. You can find quiet, you can find adrenaline rush, and I think for me as I engage in my entrepreneurial life, obviously I run an outdoor store, and we promote the backcountry, and we take people into the backcountry, and so we want people to be doing those things. But if it was just a saleable item, I don't think I could get passionate about it. It's not that I saw this market niche and I figured that I'll just tell people to go hiking and it'll all work out for me financially. There's easier ways to make money, I assure you. But to me, it's just so important. I know what it's done for my life, and so to pass that on to people is a huge part of my mandate. And so on a city level, it's the same. I'm focused on getting our community out into the outdoors, back connected to the outdoors, and that onus is on me as well with my public policy that I try to push around bike lanes and walkable cities and green space within our urban cores, and yet also easy access and affordable access to whether it's backcountry trails or other forms of recreation. It's a huge priority for me, for sure.
Is there any other questions just before we wrap up? I'll take this, thanks. So I just want to say a huge thank you to Sam for coming and taking the time out of your busy schedule. And when we called Sam up to do this, he just said, "Yep," just like that. So and you're rolling with the sunshine here, and we really appreciate you coming. And I think for me, on a personal level, as a mental health nurse, as a new mom, as a Chilliwack girl, it's been really inspirational to hear this and to remind myself to recalibrate, as you say, and reconnect. And so I really appreciate that, and I think all of us can probably relate to this, and it's a good reminder for all of us. So on behalf of the Faculty of Health Sciences, thank you very much for coming.
Thanks.
Here's a little token of our appreciation.
Thank you. Yeah.